I stared at the tiny plastic stick like it had just whispered a secret I wasn't meant to hear. 2 pink lines. I knew what they meant, of course. I'd known before I even took the test, but somehow seeing it confirmed made it feel louder, more final, like the closing click of a door behind me. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, still holding the stick in both hands, elbows resting on my knees. The silence in the bathroom felt too sharp. I'd turned the fan off and shut the door, as if privacy were something I could physically barricade myself into. My heart was doing this strange thing, beating hard, but not fast, like it wanted to be calm but couldn't quite get there. Pregnant. The word echoed, full of weight, full of consequence. It felt like a word you weren't supposed to say aloud, unless you were glowing and in love and surrounded by congratulatory hugs. I didn't feel glowing. I felt raw. I wish I could say my first emotion was joy, or even fear. But honestly, it was confusion. A kind of thick, slow confusion. Like my brain was walking through syrup trying to process everything at once. This wasn't how I'd pictured it. I hadn't mapped out a grand plan for my life, but I always thought that if I did have a baby, it would be after someone told me they couldn't wait to raise a family with me, after my mom cried tears of joy instead of judgment, after I had some version of a soft place to land. I looked down at my stomach, flat, still mine, and tried to imagine it carrying a life. A small heartbeat buried under skin and layers of unspoken things. I don't know how long I sat there, just breathing and thinking and not thinking all at once. Time had that strange elasticity it gets when you're on the edge of something irreversible. I thought about calling someone, my best friend, a coworker, even him, but none of those names felt right. It was like I'd suddenly crossed into a space where the only voice that made sense was mine. So, I spoke to her. Or him. I didn't know yet. I don't know what I'm doing, I whispered, but I think I want to do this. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't brave or beautiful. It was just honest. I wrapped the test in toilet paper and put it in the bin, then instantly pulled it out again. I didn't want to throw it away. Not yet. It felt like throwing away the only proof that something real had just begun. Instead, I washed my hands slowly and leaned over the sink. My reflection looked the same dark eyes, same tired expression, same flyaway hairs that never quite behaved, but something had shifted. I wasn't just me anymore. There was someone else now, and that changed everything. I opened the cabinet, pulled out a shoebox from behind the towels, and placed the test inside. A beginning, however fragile. I shut the lid gently. Then I sat down again, and I breathed. I waited 3 days. 3 whole days of carrying the secret inside me, letting it sink deeper into the folds of my mind and body. I went to work like normal, smiled at people in the supermarket, answered texts with my usual dry humor. But underneath it all, I was different, like a split had formed between the life people saw and the one growing quietly inside me. By the time I finally told Mom, I'd played the conversation out in my head 100 times. In some versions, she cried. In others, she was stunned into silence, then slowly softened. In the best one, she reached for my hand and said, "We'll figure this out. You're not alone." I don't know why I imagined those things. I think hope has a funny way of sneaking in, even when you think you've locked it out. I chose a Sunday evening. I knew she'd be at home, probably folding laundry in the living room while watching one of her true crime documentaries. I walked the familiar route to her house, past the same garden gnomes and cracked paving stones I'd grown up skipping over. Everything looked exactly the same, but nothing felt the same. When she opened the door, she gave me a once-over. "You look pale," she said, not unkindly, just in that way she has of always pointing out things I'd rather she didn't. "I need to talk to you," I said. That got her attention. She stepped aside to let me in, then followed me to the kitchen like I was about to confess to a crime. I sat at the table. She stood. That was the first sign this wouldn't go how I hoped. "I'm pregnant," I said, the words coming out cleaner than I expected. No trembling, no apology. Her expression didn't change at first. It just froze. Then something cold flickered across her face. Whose is it? I swallowed. It doesn't matter. He's not in the picture. She exhaled sharply through her nose. Not quite a laugh, more like disbelief wrapped in contempt. Well, she said, I hope you're not expecting me to be happy about this. I didn't say anything. My chest tightened. She crossed her arms. You're throwing your life away. For what? A mistake? The word hung there. Mistake. Something inside me cracked. Quietly, not visibly, but I felt it. Like the floor beneath. Me had given way a little. I'm keeping it, I said. She scoffed. Of course you are. You always did like making things harder for yourself. That was when I stopped hoping for softness. For once, I didn't cry. I just stood up. I didn't come here for permission, I said quietly. I came to tell you because I thought you deserved to know. She didn't answer, so I left. As I walked back home, the air felt sharper, like it was trying to bite. But weirdly, I felt steadier, like the part of me that always twisted to please her had finally snapped straight. I went home, locked the door, and sat on the bed. She'd called her a mistake, but I was already starting to think of her as a reason. The flat felt different after that night. It wasn't just the silence. I'd always been used to that. It was the new kind of quiet. Heavier, more present. Like the walls were holding their breath with me. I kept expecting to cry. You know, the kind of sobs that take everything out of you, make you curl into yourself and forget what day it is. But the tears didn't come. Instead, I just stood in the center of the living room and looked around like I was seeing it for the first time. The peeling paint in the corner, the slanted light coming through the blinds, the half-dead plant I kept forgetting to water. And then I looked down at my stomach. Nothing had changed on the outside. I didn't look pregnant, but I knew she was there, quiet and steady, like a flame I'd lit in the middle of a storm. I made a cup of tea, because that's what you do when you don't know what else to do, and sat by the window. I watched people walking home from the pub, laughing too loudly. I watched a cat dart across the street. I even watched a piece of bin bag float down the road like it had somewhere to be. And all the while, that word echoed in my head. Mistake. She'd said it like a fact, like it was the only logical conclusion. Not even cruel, really. Just cold. Like she was reading it off a list of reasons I'd disappointed her over the years. Failing my driving test, not going to uni, dating men she didn't approve of. And now, this. But sitting there with my hands wrapped around the mug, I started to feel something shift. This wasn't about her. Not anymore. She could call it whatever she wanted. But I'd felt it the moment I saw those two lines. I'd felt something light up inside me, something terrifying but beautiful. This wasn't a mistake. It was a turning point. I wouldn't pretend I had everything figured out. I was terrified. I had 1,000 questions and 0 answers. But for the first time in my life, I had a reason to stop running, to start building something that was mine. That night, I took a pen and wrote in an old notebook I hadn't touched in months. Just the date at the top, and then a line. Today, I chose to keep going. It didn't feel brave. It didn't even feel strong. It just felt real. I fell asleep with the notebook still open beside me and my hand resting on my belly. I imagined her there, small and tucked in like a secret. We were both quiet, but neither of us were mistakes. I woke up before the sun the next morning. It wasn't from a nightmare or a noise. I just opened my eyes, and there it was. A kind of restlessness sitting right under my skin. A hum, like my body had finally caught up with everything my heart already knew. I made toast I didn't want to eat and stared at the fridge. It was covered in old takeaway menus and a postcard from a friend I hadn't seen in over a year. "Wish you were here," it said. I remember laughing when I first read it. I didn't even know where here was. Somewhere sunny, probably. Anywhere but this. But now, maybe this was exactly where I needed to be. I got out a notepad and wrote baby list at the top. Not because I had money to spare or plans to go shopping. I just needed to see it, to start somewhere. Clothes, bottles, nappies, cot, pram, blankets. Names. Names. That word held so much weight. It made me stop. My stomach still didn't show, but I already felt like I knew her. Not fully, not yet. But something inside me whispered that she was gentle, curious, a little stubborn maybe. I smiled and wrote soft but strong next to names. I wanted something that would carry her, something that would sound beautiful when she said it aloud to herself in the mirror. Later that day, I went out. Just a quick walk to the corner shop, but it felt like a small act of rebellion. I bought crackers and lemonade, even though I wanted chocolate. I passed the baby aisle without looking, heart thumping like mad. Then I saw a knitted hat on the discount shelf, cream-colored, tiny. I held it in my hands for the longest time. It looked too small for anything real, like a doll's accessory. But it made everything feel possible. Not easy, not simple, just real. I bought it. First thing I ever got for her. Back at home, I sat on the floor and folded it neatly into Tootsie, a drawer I cleared out for baby things. Just one drawer for now, but it felt like laying the first brick of something I didn't even have blueprints for. Mom didn't call. I didn't expect her to. She was probably too busy sulking about the way I'd left her kitchen without finishing the tea. I didn't care. Not today. That night, I lit a candle. No special reason. I just wanted a bit of warmth. I sat in the glow of it, notebook in my lap, pen in hand. I wrote, "Today, I bought a hat. It was tiny and soft, and I held it like it mattered. Because it does. Because she does. Because maybe I do too." And for the first time in weeks, I felt something close. To peace. Not loud or sweeping, just quiet, like a promise whispered in the dark. The next few days blurred together, the kind of days that slip through your fingers like water, where nothing seems important enough to remember, and yet everything feels too much to ignore. I stayed busy, mostly keeping to myself. The neighbors probably thought I was overthinking, or maybe they didn't care at all. Mom didn't call. Of course she didn't. But I had stopped expecting her to, so it didn't sting as much anymore. It was midweek when I finally gathered enough courage to ring her. Her number flashed on the screen, the familiar digits freezing me for a moment. It felt like I was making a decision I couldn't take back. Was I ready for whatever she'd say next? The phone rang 3 times before she picked up, a slight edge to her voice. "What is it?" Her tone stung, but I refused to let it stop me. "Mom, I don't have time for this." Her words were clipped, dismissive. "If you're calling for money, it's not happening." "I'm not asking for money." I breathed out slowly, trying to settle the frustration bubbling in my chest. "I need to talk to you." There was a long silence, the kind where I could feel the space between us widening even further. I wasn't sure if she was listening, or if she was just waiting for me to finish so she could hang up. Finally, she sighed, too loudly. "Fine. What is it? Make it quick." I let the words fall out before I could stop myself. "I'm pregnant, Mum. I'm having a baby." There was an awful silence, like everything in the room froze for just a second. Then she scoffed, a harsh, cruel laugh that made my stomach twist. "A baby?" Her voice was cold, flat, like she'd just heard the most ridiculous thing. "And you think you're ready for this? Do you know what this is going to do to your life?" I opened my mouth to say something, but nothing came out. I had no words for her. Not anymore. "Do you realize what you've done?" she continued, the disgust clear in every syllable. "You've made a mistake, and now you're going to drag me into it. Don't expect me to clean up your mess." I closed my eyes, my grip tightening around the phone. I felt so small, so utterly alone in that moment. But I wasn't going to cry. Not now. Not for her. "I don't need you to clean up anything, Mum," I said, each word deliberate. "I just needed to let you know." And with that, I hung up. I stared at the phone for a long time, feeling the weight of everything pressing in on me. The hurt, the anger, the frustration. It was all swirling in my chest like a storm I couldn't control. But something had changed in me. For the first time in years, I hadn't crumbled. I hadn't begged for her approval. I'd simply told her the truth. And that was the first step in my journey. The first step toward protecting my peace. The storm inside me was still raging, but I felt a quiet strength grow with each passing minute. I wasn't the same person who'd made the call, and I wasn't going to let her make me feel small again. The days after the call felt strangely still. It wasn't the calm you get after a storm passes, but the silence that lingers when there's nothing left to say. I kept busy, of course. I had to. But even in the noise of everyday life, the weight of Mum's words followed me around, trailing behind like a shadow I couldn't shake. I spent hours sorting through baby clothes, most of which had been gifts from friends or secondhand finds. They were small, soft, and smelled faintly of lavender and dust. It was a small kind of peace, folding tiny onesies and imagining what it would be like to hold this baby in my arms. But the joy of these moments was always punctuated by thoughts of her, my mother, who I had spent my life trying to please, who always seemed to find fault in everything I did. The weight of her disappointment had followed me for so long that I wasn't sure who I'd be without it. As the days passed, I started remembering the little things, small moments from my childhood that had shaped who I was. Things I hadn't thought about in years, but that now seemed so obvious. Like the way she'd always said I was too sensitive, too quiet, or how, whenever I achieved something, it never seemed to be enough. Nothing was ever enough for her. Even as a little girl, I'd been careful not to ask too much of her, not to push her for affection or attention. I thought if I stayed out of her way, maybe she'd see me, maybe she'd care, but she never did. And I had spent so much of my life holding on to that hope, like a fragile thread, afraid to let it snap. I thought back to the times I'd asked her for help, whether it was to fix a scraped knee or to sit with me when I was sick. There was always an excuse, too busy, too tired, too angry, always something that kept her from being there when I needed her. The weight of all those years pressed down on me, all the times I'd longed for her to simply say, "I'm proud of you," or "You're enough." But the words never came. Instead, I learned to rely on myself, to fight for everything I wanted, even when no one else believed in me. And now, with this baby on the way, I realized something. I had spent so long trying to earn her love, trying to win her approval, that I'd forgotten how to love myself. I'd forgotten how to believe in myself, independent of what she thought or said. I was doing this on my own. I would raise this child with or without her. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to beg for her acceptance. The baby's tiny kicks reminded me that I wasn't alone, not anymore. The love I was beginning to feel for this little one was so pure, so unconditional, that it pushed aside everything else. It was the kind of love I had never known from her, but it was the kind I was going to give. As the days grew into weeks, I stopped looking back. The past no longer had the power to shape me. I wasn't my mother's disappointment anymore. I was something else entirely. I was a mother. And for once, that was enough. I was learning, slowly but surely, that peace doesn't come from waiting for someone else to change. It comes from changing yourself. And I was starting to find mine. As my belly grew rounder, so did my sense of determination. The reality of motherhood was settling in, not just in the form of a child I could feel growing inside me, but in the choices I was making. Choices I'd never been able to make before. Lynx spent more time alone, but not in the way I had been alone before. It wasn't loneliness, but a kind of solitude that felt necessary. Like I was finally building a space where I could breathe. I rearranged my flat to make room for the crib, for the small things, a changing table, a rocking chair, and I found myself smiling at the thought of this tiny person taking up so much space in my life. It was the little things that started to matter the most. I taught myself how to cook healthy meals, filled the fridge with fresh fruit and vegetables. I made lists of everything I needed, and every item checked off felt like an accomplishment. I was doing this. I wasn't waiting for anyone to rescue me. Mom never called. In fact, she didn't even acknowledge that I was pregnant unless I was the one to bring it up. The silence was a loud, oppressive thing. but I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I had learned that silence didn't mean I was unimportant. It didn't mean I was invisible. It simply meant that I was no longer giving her the power to make me feel that way. I often thought about how I'd been raised. It was like growing up in a house full of echoes. Nothing ever felt real. Nothing ever felt warm. Everything I had learned about love had come from books, from movies, from the world outside of home. I had to teach myself what it meant to love and be loved. And now, with this child on the way, I was finally understanding it. There were moments, though, when the weight of what I'd been through threatened to pull me back. Moments when I thought about the way Mom had looked at me over the years. Cold, distant, always measuring me, always finding me lacking. I could hear her voice in my head, saying things like, "You'll never make it on your own," or "You'll fail, just like you always do." But now, those words didn't have the same power. I had heard them for so long that they were no longer the truth. They were just noise, echoes of a past that didn't have to define me anymore. I was carving a new path. I was choosing to be something different, something better. There was a moment in the quiet of the night when the only sound in the room was the soft ticking of the clock that I realized something. I had spent my whole life hoping for someone to see me, to recognize me, to love me in the way I'd always needed. But the truth was, I didn't need anyone to see me like that anymore. I had learned to see myself. The baby kicked again, a sharp little reminder of the life growing inside me, and I pressed my hand to my belly, feeling the soft flutter. I smiled, my heart swelling with love. This was the future. This was my future. And nothing could take that away from me. Mom could keep her silence. She could keep her judgment. But I wasn't waiting for her to validate me anymore. I had my own validation now. And with it, I was going to create a life that was full of love. Not just for my baby, but for myself. The days blurred together in a quiet rhythm. I was getting closer to the moment I'd been preparing for, the moment when everything would change. The nursery was ready, small but cozy, with soft pastel colors on the walls and a crib nestled in the corners. I'd spent hours arranging it, making sure everything was perfect. My little one would have everything she needed, and I would do everything I could to make sure she felt loved and safe. But there was still one thing left to do, one thing that had been weighing heavily on me for weeks. The letter I'd written days ago, but each time I picked it up, I hesitated. How could I put into words the feelings I had been suppressing for years? How could I explain to her, to Mom, that I was finally done? Done with her criticisms, done with the emotional neglect, done with waiting for her approval. The letter wasn't just for her, it was for me. It was the final step in my journey of cutting ties, of reclaiming my life. I couldn't do this if I didn't let go of everything that had been holding me back. I ran my fingers over the envelope. The neat, slanted handwriting on the front read, "Mum." It felt like a weight pressing against my chest, but there was also a strange sense of relief in holding it. This letter, this decision, was mine. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't asking for permission to be free. As I sat there on the edge of the bed, I wondered if I would ever be able to fully understand the depth of what I was about to do. It wasn't just severing ties with someone. It was severing ties with an idea, a version of myself that I had spent my whole life trying to please, trying to fix. Would she even care? Would she feel anything when she read it? I hadn't told her when I first found out I was pregnant. I hadn't shared the news because I knew what the response would be. There would be no warmth, no excitement, no joy. Just more of the same judgment, the same coldness I had lived with for years. So I hadn't said a word. And in the silence, I had built my own strength. The decision to send the letter wasn't just about the pregnancy. It wasn't even really about her. It was about me choosing to stop living in the shadow of her disappointment. It was about choosing myself and my future over the past that had defined me for too long. I had already imagined her reaction: disbelief, anger, hurt, but none of it mattered anymore. This wasn't a plea for understanding. It wasn't an invitation for her to change. It was simply the final step in cutting the cord that had tied me to the emotional weight of a mother who had never loved me the way I needed. I took a deep breath and placed the letter on the kitchen counter. The envelope was there, waiting, and soon I would give it to her. I hadn't realized until that moment just how much I had grown. I was no longer the frightened girl trying to make everything right. I was a woman, and soon I would be a mother. And that was all that mattered. The day of the ceremony arrived, and the house felt different, full of expectation, of quiet anticipation. I had invited only a few people, those who mattered to me, those who had shown up without conditions, without judgment. The air was thick, with the scent of candles, the soft hum of voices, and the sounds of a new chapter unfolding. The small gathering was intimate, far removed from the large celebrations that others might have had, but for me, it was enough. The small room was filled with flowers, their bright colors contrasting the muted tones of the furniture, and at the center, the delicate wooden table held the simple items I had carefully chosen for this day. A small cake with my daughter's name written in icing, a soft blanket folded neatly on the chair beside it, and the most precious of all, the envelope. I had planned it carefully, each step calculated to make sure that the moment would unfold as I intended. There would be no drama, no scene, only a quiet declaration of my decision, of my newfound strength. I could hear Mum's voice outside the room before she entered. She was speaking loudly, almost as if trying to make sure she wasn't being ignored. Her footsteps sounded familiar, but the coldness in them made my chest tighten. She was here, but the gap between us, the one that had been growing for years, felt larger than ever. She entered the room, her eyes scanning the few guests. A tight smile on her lips. It was the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. She nodded curtly, acknowledging the celebration, but I could feel the tension in her posture, in the way she held herself. I stood at the table, my fingers lightly tracing the edges of the envelope. I had made sure the paper felt thick between my fingers, the weight of my decision embedded in its folds. She hadn't spoken to me much about the pregnancy since that first harsh exchange, but I knew that today, as I handed her the letter, things would finally change. There would be no more pretending, no more hoping for something that would never come. "Are you going to sit down?" Mum asked, her voice tinged with annoyance as she noticed I hadn't joined the others yet. I nodded but didn't move. Instead, I took a slow breath and held the envelope in both hands, turning it over so she could see her name written across the front. My heart raced as I stepped closer to her. "I have something for you," I said, my voice calm, steady, far steadier than I had ever imagined I could be. Her eyes flickered to the envelope, a brief flash of curiosity, then a smirk. "What, now?" she asked with barely hidden sarcasm. I didn't respond. I simply extended my hand, placing the envelope in hers. Her fingers curled around it, but she didn't open it. She just looked at me, her face unreadable. The room seemed to grow quieter, and the air between us thickened. The others were watching, waiting, unsure of what would come next. "Mum," I began, my voice stronger now. "I want you to understand something. Everything I've done for her, for my daughter. I've worked hard, I've fought, and I've prepared." I took a step back, standing tall, my chest rising with each breath. "This is for her, not for you." I watched her face as she processed my words. There was a flicker of confusion, then annoyance. But I didn't falter. This was it. This was the moment when I would step fully into my own life, free from the chains of the past. She tore open the envelope, the sound sharp in the silence. I could see her gaze moving over the letter, the ultrasound photo inside. The message was clear. It wasn't for her to understand. It wasn't for her to approve of. The letter was mine. The decision was mine. Her face twisted into something unrecognizable, her mouth opening to speak, but I wasn't listening anymore. I had already said everything I needed to say. Her reaction was exactly what I had expected, yet it still stung. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at the letter, then flicked to the ultrasound photo, her face contorting with disbelief and anger. "You think this will make me change my mind?" she snapped, the words biting like ice. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. For the first time in my life, I wasn't begging for her approval. I wasn't waiting for her to validate my choices. I stood there, still, calm. Everything I needed to say had already been said. The silence stretched between us, heavier than any words we could exchange. I could feel the tension in my chest, that familiar knot that had tied itself there over the years. But I refused to let it overwhelm me now. Not today. Not anymore. She opened her mouth again, probably to insult me, to tell me how foolish I was, how I was throwing my life away. I could see the words forming in her mind, like venom waiting to be unleashed. But before she could speak, I took a deep breath and gently placed my hand on the edge of the table, steadying myself. "You're right," I said quietly, my voice almost a whisper, but filled with a resolve that surprised even me. "This isn't about changing your mind. This is about me choosing my own path. You've never really seen me, have you? Not for who I am, only for what I could do for you, but this is mine. She is mine, and I won't let you tear us apart." I watched her face shift from disbelief to pure rage. Her lips parted, her hands clenched into fists, and I could see the struggle inside her, the effort it took to hold back the torrent of words she desperately wanted to throw at me. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice trembling, the facade of control slipping. "You'll regret this. You'll regret cutting me out of your life. You can't do this alone." Her words stung, but I didn't let them reach me. "I'm not alone," I said firmly. "I've never been alone. I have her, and that's enough. I've always had enough." The room was deathly quiet. My mother stood there, frozen, her hands still holding the envelope. But now it seemed like a weight, something she couldn't quite grasp. Her eyes flickered to the other guests, to the few friends who had come to share this moment with me. Their faces were still, waiting for her reaction. But it didn't matter. Not anymore. I turned away, slowly, deliberately. "I've made my peace," I said, my voice steady as I moved towards the door. "I'm protecting my future now, and that means cutting ties with the past." The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what I was doing. I had chosen peace, and for the first time, it felt like the right decision. For me. For her. Outside the room, I felt a wave of calm wash over me. It was as if the weight of years of criticism, of blame, of being overlooked had been lifted. I had let go of the past. I had made my stand. And now, for the first time, I was free. I hadn't expected the relief to come so quickly, but it did. The moment I stepped out of that room, the weight lifted from my shoulders. I could breathe again. I had cut the ties that had bound me for so long. I had severed the link to the past that had kept me stuck in a cycle of self-doubt, of constantly measuring my worth against her expectations. But now, I was free. I was free to create the life I had always imagined, the one that was mine, and mine alone. I hadn't thought much about the aftermath when I handed her that letter. It wasn't about her reaction. It was about me, about finally taking control of my life. But as I stepped into the quiet of my apartment, the reality of it all started to settle in. I wasn't just alone in that room. I was alone in this world in a way I'd never felt before. I wasn't sure if that scared me or gave me the freedom I'd always craved. The weeks after that day were a blur. The naming ceremony had been small, just a handful of friends who truly cared about me. They didn't ask questions. They didn't judge. They just celebrated with me. I held my daughter in my arms as I'd always imagined I would. Proudly, confidently. She was my reason for everything now. Everything had changed since the day I saw that positive test result, but nothing had changed more than the way I saw myself. I spent days preparing for her arrival, creating a home for her that was filled with warmth and love. The nursery was simple, no lavish decorations, no expensive furniture, just the essentials. But it was perfect. It was ours. I knew I wasn't the perfect mother. I knew there would be challenges. There would be sleepless nights, moments of doubt, and times when I questioned whether I was doing enough. But I was ready. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was ready. My phone sat silent on the kitchen counter. The silence had been a constant companion since the day I severed all contact with my mother. I hadn't reached out to her since then, and she hadn't tried to reach me either. Part of me had expected her to make one last attempt to break me, to remind me of everything I was walking away from. But she didn't. And maybe, in some strange way, that was the most telling thing of all. I wasn't waiting for her anymore. I wasn't waiting for her approval, for her validation, or for her love. I had learned that I was enough even without it. As the days passed, I grew stronger in this new role I had taken on. I wasn't just a mother. I was an individual, someone capable of making her own choices. I had always been defined by the relationships I had with others, first with my mother, then with the people who surrounded me. But now, I was defined by one thing alone, my daughter, and that, in itself, was enough. With each passing day, I could feel myself stepping further into this new version of myself. The future felt uncertain, yes, but it also felt full of possibilities. And as I stood in front of the small crib I had assembled, I whispered softly, almost to myself, "This is it. This is our new beginning." For the first time in my life, I was choosing me. And in doing so, I was choosing her. And that was everything. The silence after that day, after the letter and the ceremony, had become an uncomfortable companion. It wasn't the kind of silence I had hoped for. The peaceful kind where everything falls into place, where you can just be. No, this was different. It was the silence of uncertainty, of the weight of the choices I had made, hanging heavy in the air like a storm cloud. It was the kind of silence that made you question whether you'd done the right thing, even when you knew deep down you had. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when I felt the peace begin to settle in. It wasn't something that would come overnight, but it was there, like the first hint of dawn after a long, dark night. I could feel it in the way I held my daughter, in the way I looked at her, as if she was my answer to all the questions I had been asking myself for years. She was my reason, and that truth was a constant comfort. The days seemed to blur together. Each morning I woke up and reminded myself of the life I was building piece by piece. There were no more distractions, no more expectations to meet. There was just me, my daughter, and the future ahead. The weight of the past seemed lighter now, like it had been shed with that letter, that final act of rebellion. But the silence, the absence of my mother's voice, was still there. It was the quiet space where everything had once been defined by her demands, her judgments. Now, that space was mine, and in it, I could finally breathe. I didn't expect my mother to reach out, not anymore, but sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I would find myself wondering, what would happen if she did? Would I answer? Would I let her back into my life just because she was family? The answer, for now, was simple. No. I wasn't sure what I would do if she tried to contact me. I wasn't sure if I was ready for that confrontation, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't be the same person I had been before. I had learned to choose myself, and that meant I wasn't willing to let someone, no matter who they were, take that choice away from me. I spent a lot of time reflecting on how things had ended up this way, how I had found myself in a cycle of self-doubt, trapped in the need for approval from someone who would never give it to me. But with every passing day, I could feel the grip of that cycle loosening. I wasn't defined by my mother anymore. I wasn't defined by anyone. I was my own person, a mother, a woman who had decided to stop waiting for others to tell her who she was. And then there was the moment when I realized something. I hadn't just severed ties with my mother. I had severed ties with the version of myself that had always sought validation from others. I had broken free of the need for approval, for love that came with strings attached. As I looked down at my daughter, sleeping peacefully in her crib, I knew that everything had changed. Not just for me, but for her too. I wasn't just protecting myself from the hurt anymore. I was protecting her, and that, in itself, made everything worth it. There was still a long road ahead. There would be challenges, moments of doubt, but for the first time in my life, I was no longer afraid of the silence. It wasn't empty anymore. It was mine. And with that silence, I could finally hear my own voice. And that was all I needed. The days after the naming ceremony felt strangely heavy. It wasn't that I regretted my decision. I knew, deep down, that it was the right one. But there was a weight to it. A weight that I couldn't shake. The kind of weight that comes from knowing you've changed the trajectory of your life forever, and there's no going back. I spent hours sitting in my small apartment, looking at my daughter, watching her sleep, watching her grow. She was so small, so innocent. She had no idea of the battles I had fought, the struggles I had endured. She was a tiny little person, yet she had already changed me more than I could have ever imagined. And that was the strangest part. She hadn't even asked for any of this. She hadn't asked for the tension with my mother, for the pain of a lifetime of criticism, for the anger that boiled beneath the surface. And yet, somehow, she was the one who had saved me. But there was the question that lingered. How had I gotten here? How had I reached this point where I could finally say, enough is enough? It wasn't an easy question to answer, and I didn't have all the answers. But I knew that somewhere, deep inside, I had always known. I had always known that I wasn't meant to live in the shadow of someone else's expectations. I had always known that I wasn't supposed to be the one who cowered in the corner, waiting for approval, waiting to be loved. The years of criticism, the constant belittling, the moments when I had tried so hard to prove myself, those years weren't just gone. They still haunted me, still whispered in the back of my mind. They weren't things I could just forget. But for the first time, I could see them for what they were. Traps. Traps I had built for myself. Traps that had kept me stuck. Convinced that I was nothing without the approval of others. It wasn't that I had never tried to break free. I had. But every time I tried, there was something holding me back. A voice in my head. A voice that sounded like my mother's, telling me I wasn't good enough, telling me I couldn't do it. And no matter how hard I fought, that voice was always there, always louder than my own. But that voice had lost its power. It wasn't that I had stopped caring altogether. I still longed for the kind of love that didn't come with conditions. I still yearned for the approval that had always seemed just out of reach, but I wasn't going to wait for it anymore. I wasn't going to sacrifice my own happiness just to get someone else to say, "You're worthy." That was the lesson my daughter had taught me. She didn't care about the past. She didn't care about what anyone thought. She just needed me to be present, to love her, to protect her. And in return, she was teaching me how to love myself again. I wasn't sure what would come next. There were still so many questions left unanswered. Would my mother ever try to make contact? Would I be able to forgive her? Or would the damage be too great? I didn't have the answers, but for the first time, it didn't matter. What mattered now was that I was no longer defined by the pain of the past. I was no longer defined by the mistakes and the regrets. I was defined by the love I had for my daughter. I was defined by the future we were going to build together. And that was enough. It's funny how life works, how just when you think you've reached the edge of your capacity, when you feel like you can't handle anymore, something shifts. It's as if the universe decides that you've suffered long enough and throws you a lifeline. That's how it felt when I looked down at my daughter's tiny face, asleep in her crib, her chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. She was my lifeline. I had no idea how I was going to get through the next few months, let alone the next few years, but I knew I would. I had to. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about her. The weight of responsibility that had once felt suffocating now felt like a cloak of strength. Every day, she relied on me. Every day, she needed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. And in that, there was a kind of clarity. But there was also the question of what would come next. The thought of my mother still lingered in the corners of my mind, haunting me at times when I least expected it. Her words echoed in my ears like a ghost that wouldn't leave me alone. "You can't do this alone. You're not capable." It had been a cruel thing to hear, coming from her, the woman who had always told me I wasn't enough. She was the person who had shaped my world with her cold indifference, and yet here I was, facing the same woman who had called my daughter a mistake. That was the final straw. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the message I would send my daughter. I couldn't let her grow up believing that her worth was ever in question. I knew I had to take control. I knew I had to stand firm in the decision I had made. That morning, I woke up to the soft gurgle of my daughter's laughter. It was a sound so pure, so joyful, that it reminded me of why I had to fight, why I had to protect her from a world that didn't care if she was a mistake or not. I couldn't afford to be weak. I couldn't afford to be swayed by guilt or by the heavy expectations of someone who had never been there for me. But the question was, how would I face my mother? How would I confront the woman who had shaped so much of my pain, the one who had never once held me in the way I needed to be held? I had tried so many times to make her see me, to make her care, but every time I felt more and more invisible. It was time to let that go. I wasn't going to beg for love. I wasn't going to beg for approval anymore. This time I would stand firm and walk away, not as a victim, but as a woman who had finally discovered her own strength. My daughter had given me the courage I needed. The truth was, there was nothing left for me to gain from her anymore. And the last thing I would do was pass on this legacy of pain to my daughter. It was time to take the step, time to leave the past behind, time to choose my future. I stood in front of the mirror that afternoon, a stillness settling within me that I hadn't felt in years. My reflection wasn't the same woman who had stood before that same mirror so many times before. She was stronger, resolute, a woman who had a life to protect, a future that was no longer defined by the weight of the past. My daughter was asleep in her crib, her tiny form curled up in a blanket I had sewn myself. Every moment I spent with her felt like a small act of defiance. It wasn't just about nurturing her, it was about choosing to live differently, to refuse the patterns that had shaped my own life for so long. The letter was in my hand now, the words I had carefully written, the emotions I had poured into every sentence, all leading to this moment. I knew it was the right thing to do. I took a deep breath and folded the letter neatly into an envelope, the ultrasound photo pressed gently inside. I had thought long and hard about the words I wanted to say to my mother. It had to be clear. It had to be final. "You called her a mistake. She's my reason." The words seemed so simple, yet so heavy. I had no intention of saying them aloud. I couldn't. This wasn't a confrontation. This was a declaration, a statement of who I had become and who I would never be again. I wasn't her to be diminished, her to be overlooked. I wasn't a shadow anymore. I hadn't wanted to reach this point, but as time wore on, the need to separate myself from my mother became clearer with each passing day. She wasn't going to change. She wasn't going to offer the love or support that a mother should give. I had waited for it for so long, clinging to the hope that one day she would see me, really see me, and finally acknowledge my worth. But she never did. The moment I handed her the envelope would be the end, the definitive line in the sand. It was not just the end of our relationship, but the beginning of my freedom. I stood there for a moment longer, my hand gripping the envelope tightly. My heart wasn't racing. It was calm, steady, as if I had been preparing for this moment my entire life. I wasn't afraid of what would happen next. The storm that would undoubtedly come once I gave it to her didn't concern me anymore. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to fight her. I had already done all of that, and it had never made a difference. This time, the fight was mine to win. The fight was for my daughter, and I was going to protect her with everything I had, even if it meant walking away from the only person who should have been there for me. With the envelope in my hand, I walked out of the room toward the next step I would take on my own. The air felt different as I approached her house. It was the same place I'd walked through 100 times, but today it felt foreign, like the very walls were closing in on me. I could hear the faint hum of the television from inside, her usual noise filling the space between us. I wasn't sure what I expected when I walked in. Whether she would act like everything was normal, or if there would be an explosion of anger and words that could cut deeper than any wound. But I knew what I had to do. I had to give it to her. The envelope, the words, the finality. There was no more room for hope, for longing. I had spent so much of my life waiting for her to change, to love me the way I needed to be loved. But that love never came, so I was going to give her something else, something I could control. My hand tightened around the envelope as I knocked on the door. The sound echoed louder than I expected, the silence that followed almost unbearable. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, and there she was. Her eyes scanned me quickly, no warmth in them, just the cool, disinterested look she always gave. The look of someone who knew she was supposed to care, but didn't know how. "What is it?" she asked, her voice flat. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stepped into the doorway and placed the envelope in her hand. Her fingers brushed against mine, and for a moment, I wondered if she could feel the weight of everything I was handing her. The years of disappointment, the hours of self-doubt, the long nights I had spent questioning my worth. Could she feel it? She opened the envelope without hesitation, and when her eyes landed on the ultrasound photo in the letter, her expression faltered just for a second. But it didn't take long for the mask to slip back into place. She glanced at me, her face contorted with a mixture of confusion and anger. "You expect me to believe this? To care?" she spat, crumpling the letter in her hand before dropping it to the floor. "She's a mistake. She's just another thing to ruin your life. You think I'm supposed to sit here and pretend this is something to celebrate?" I stood there, the silence stretching between us. It wasn't the first time she had called me a mistake. It wasn't the first time she had belittled my choices, my existence. But this time, I didn't flinch. I didn't feel the sting that usually followed her words. "You called her a mistake. She's my reason," I said, my voice calm, stronger than it had ever been. I could hear the words in my head, their power building with every syllable. It was no longer about her opinions. It was about me, and it was about my daughter. Her face twisted with fury, and she threw the ultrasound photo across the room. The sound of it slapping against the wall sharpened the stillness. But I didn't move. I didn't react. I just stood there, rooted to the spot, the weight of the moment settling into my bones. "You're making a huge mistake," she hissed, but the words no longer had the sting they once did. They were just noise. Empty. Meaningless. I was done listening. Done waiting. "I'm choosing peace," I said, my voice steady, unwavering. "And I'm protecting my future. Our future." I turned on my heel and walked out, the door closing softly, behind me. I had given her the chance to be a part of my life, a part of my daughter's life. But now, it was over. No more apologies, no more hoping. I was free, and nothing could change that. The drive home was quiet, the hum of the engine a steady rhythm that matched the pulse in my veins. I kept my hands on the steering wheel, my grip tight, but not from fear. It was something else. Maybe relief. Maybe the beginning of peace that I had been chasing for so long. The world outside was still the same, but I felt different, like I had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. When I pulled into the driveway, I didn't rush. I let the engine idle for a moment, taking in the sight of my small house. It was humble, nothing grand, but it was mine, and soon it would be filled with the life of my daughter. The thought made me smile, a genuine warm smile that I hadn't been able to offer myself in years. I stepped out of the car and stood for a moment, looking at the sky. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over everything. The same sky that had once felt oppressive and heavy now felt like a blanket of possibilities. It was as if the weight had finally lifted, and I could breathe freely again. Inside, everything was as it had been when I left. quiet, peaceful, a stark contrast to the storm I had just left behind. The thought of what had just transpired with my mother didn't seem to weigh on me as I expected it to. No tears, no regret, only an overwhelming sense of finality. It was over. I made my way to the nursery, where the small crib sat in the corner of the room. It was all ready. Crib assembled, soft blankets folded neatly, little clothes hanging in the closet. I ran my hand over the fabric of one of the blankets, my fingers brushing the softness of it. This was for her. Every little thing in this room was for her. I had done it all alone, and I would continue to do so. I knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be sleepless nights, moments of doubt, and times when I would wonder if I was enough. But one thing was clear to me now. I was her mother, and I was enough. I sat down on the rocking chair, the one I had chosen for those late-night feeds and quiet moments. My hands rested on my growing belly, the gentle movements of my daughter, reminding me of the strength that lay inside both of us. I didn't need my mother's approval. I didn't need her love, or her support, or her validation. What I needed, what I had always needed, was to be enough for myself, and now I was. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, but then something inside me told me to get up, to face whatever was on the other side of that door. When I opened it, I saw the face of an old friend, someone I hadn't seen in years. She was holding a small gift, a soft smile on her lips. Her eyes flickered down to my belly before she spoke. "Is it all right if I come in?" she asked, her voice gentle, filled with understanding. I smiled and nodded, stepping aside to let her in. Maybe this was the kind of support I needed now. Someone who didn't expect anything from me, someone who simply wanted to be there. And for the first time, I didn't feel so alone. The days that followed were quieter, not in the sense that the world around me had become still, but because I had learned to quiet the chaos within. I spent the next few weeks preparing for my daughter's arrival, filling the spaces of my life with small, deliberate actions that grounded me. The house became a sanctuary, each corner filled with things that brought comfort. Soft blankets, toys, books. The quiet moments of putting everything in place felt like building something new, a life that was entirely mine and my daughter's. The weeks stretched into months, and though the anticipation of my daughter's birth loomed, the feeling of peace never faltered. I woke each morning with purpose, my routine simple and calm. The time I had with myself now seemed sacred, no longer overshadowed by the looming presence of my mother's disapproval. I wasn't her disappointment. I wasn't anyone's mistake, and I was never going to allow myself to be defined by her. Wasn't always easy. There were days when I still thought of my mother, of how cruel her words had been, of the ache that had once settled deep in my heart. But now, the memories didn't have the same sting. Instead, they were just that, memories. They belonged to the past, where they would remain. I had learned the hard way that the only person who could truly build my future was me, and I was doing just that. The day my daughter was born was a blur of exhaustion, pain, and overwhelming joy. Holding her for the first time, feeling her tiny fingers curl around mine, made everything I had gone through worthwhile. It was as if I had been waiting for this moment my whole life, and now, in my arms, I held the future, her future. As the weeks went on, I found strength in the small moments, feeding her in the quiet of the night, hearing her first coo, seeing the way her little face changed with every new expression. She was growing, she was thriving, and I was learning too. I still didn't have my mother's support. There were no apologies, no warm embrace, no promises of change. But I had something better. I had a daughter who would never know the feeling of being called a mistake. She would never feel small or insignificant in this world. She would grow up knowing her worth, and no one, not even her grandmother, could take that from her. One evening, after a long day of caring for her, I sat down with a notebook and pen. I wrote my daughter a letter. Not just the typical welcome to the world kind of letter, but one that spoke to everything I had learned in my life. The pain, the growth, the strength, and the love that had emerged from the ashes of everything I had endured. "I hope you never feel small," I wrote. "I hope you always know your worth, even when the world tries to make you doubt it. You are everything, and I am proud to be your mother." The letter was simple, but it felt like the culmination of everything I had worked for. It was a promise to myself and to her that we would face the future together, with strength and grace. The past was behind us, and now I could finally look ahead. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was living. I was thriving. And I was going to protect my future. Our future. The doorbell rang once more, but this time I didn't hesitate. As I opened the door, I wasn't sure what would come next, but I knew I was ready.